I'm like, that soup was really, I know, it's like, I'm like, oh, I feel so.
The City of Everett Planning Commission meeting. Today is Tuesday, October 15th, 2019.
Can I have roll call, please?
Chair Beck,
Here.
Commissioner Holland. Here. Commissioner Tisdale.
Here.
Commissioner Zielinski.
Here.
Commissioner McGinn. Here. Commissioner Lark.
Here.
Commissioner Finch.
Here.
Okay, has everybody had an opportunity to read the minutes? Do I hear any changes that need to occur to the minutes? Do I hear a move to approve the minutes?
Move to approve the September 17th meeting minutes as presented.
Second.
Commissioner Finch.
Yes.
Commissioner Lark.
Yes.
Commissioner McGinn. Yes. Commissioner Zielinski.
Yes.
Commissioner Tisdale.
Yes.
Commissioner Holland.
Yes.
Chair Beck.
Yes. So we'll go down the line here. Does anyone have any reports? And we'll start with Commissioner Finch.
No report.
Nothing to report.
No report.
No report?
No report.
Nothing for me this evening.
And nothing for me as well. About staff.
Hi, Alan Giffen, Planning Director. We will be meeting, I think that's 3 weeks from tonight. I don't recall the date. Is that November 5th? Okay, yeah, November 5th. We do have an item related to our comprehensive plan docket for a change of permitted building height in an area on Everett Avenue. And we may find a few other things to talk about, but that's the main item of business that night.
So for that night, that'll just be a workshop on the docket applications?
It's a public hearing.
Oh, okay, okay. All right. At this time, if there's anybody in the audience that would like to speak to anything that is not on the agenda, please feel free to come forward. I've received some requests to speak, but most of these are related to agenda items, so is there anybody that would like to come forward at this time? Seeing none, we'll go ahead and get started with item number 1, the Climate Action Plan.
Okay, Karen Stewart from the Planning Division. I'd like to introduce Councilman Paul Roberts is here tonight just to kick off our discussion of the Climate Action Plan.
Chair Beck and members of the Commission. I'm Paul Roberts, member of the City Council and the author of the sponsor of the resolution 7359 that brings that matter to you. So I want to thank you for continuing in your and focus on this. Also, I want to thank the people who've come here tonight. There was a workshop that preceded this meeting, and we've had an opportunity to take input from the public. And I know that won't be the only time, but it's an important one because our consultants, who will be, I'm sure, speaking to you in a few minutes, have been working really hard to produce a draft, and that draft is now available for the community to see. So, or at least I think it is. If not, it will be very soon. I guess I would just say I want to leave a couple of comments here tonight because the task that you have will, of course, come back to us, and we are looking forward very much to what you have to tell us and the advice that you have to give us on the City Council. But I would also say one of the other hats I wear is I still work in this field and represent cities, the Association of Cities to be particular, on sustainability and looking at these issues broadly, not just statewide, but nationally and internationally as well. And I had a good fortune to be in Denmark 2 weeks ago looking at their systems, their infrastructure systems, their water systems, their energy systems. And I've also had, as a function of that work, the opportunity and the obligation to look very carefully and at the work produced by the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And in particular, the report they produced exactly 1 year ago that talked about what we would have to do to address a 1.5 degrees Celsius warming target. It is sobering reading, and it is the sort of thing that helps us realize that what we have before us is serious, serious work and needs serious attention. I don't say that because I somehow believe you won't give it that. I know you will, but I say it to underscore the importance because there's a lot of folks here tonight who will want to speak to you about that, and that is great. I would ask you to consider a bit of a metaphor for the work before us. First, that whatever you give us and whatever we adopt needs to have a vision that goes out in the future, about as far out as we can see in the future, because this issue will be with us for the rest of our lives, professionally and otherwise. So when we look at a climate action plan, the three legs of the stool that we typically look at are mitigation, reducing greenhouse gases, adaptation, responding to the events that are already occurring and will continue to occur, and the green economy. They are all critical. And to put that in perspective, on September 9, we had storm events in Everett, 2 of which, separate events, each of which met or exceeded 100-year storm events in terms of rainfall. These, unfortunately, are becoming more frequent, and all of the data suggests that they will continue to be. So that just underscores the importance. This is something that we're dealing with today, not sometime in the future. So I would ask that you look at this role as a bit on the lighter side. Imagine that you've just gone in, of course it would be a health food restaurant, but you've just gone into the greatest restaurant in the state, and you have before you a menu. And all of the items on that menu are just about as enticing as they can be. But the capacity for you to buy all of the things on the menu is not there. And even if you could, the capacity for you to eat all of the things that you would buy is not real. And so it forces us to make choices sooner and later, and which are the most important to make sooner and why. I would ask you to please give us your best advice on that, because there's all sorts of evidence, and I happen to believe that reducing greenhouse gas emissions is a high priority, but it needs to be done in certain ways, and in any event, it's not the only priority. When people's basements flood, that's their priority right now. So it's a matter of looking at that menu and making the choices and giving us your best advice, and also why you think that's the best advice. So I please invite you to give us that. I know you will. I know you'll take this very seriously. I think I know each and every one of you, some of you better than others, but I know you are an amazingly thoughtful group, and you will give us good advice, and we look forward to it. So I have a neighborhood meeting tonight, and I also sit in a quasi-judicial role on one of the other matters that will be before you. So I will be disappearing in a few minutes to get to my neighborhood meeting. It is not for lack of interest, but I want to thank you for this work. I want to underscore its importance, and I very much look forward to reading every word of what you provide, and I assure you I will. And also, we as the last thing I want to say, in our budget reality, is that the City of Everett will adopt its budget in December, and so the 2020 budget will be relatively set before we actually get your recommendations. So a lot of what you will be telling us will be in preparation for either something we can do right now that won't be really, really expensive, or something we need to be preparing to do moving forward and need to make adjustments, and then preparing the FY21 budget, because that's just the reality of the timing of the things that we have before us. And I think the public needs to understand that as well. But we thank you. We look forward to your recommendations. And I'm happy to answer questions, but I'm far more interested in getting off this away from the microphone and hearing what others have to tell us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Councilperson Roberts. Does anybody have any questions for Councilperson Roberts before he takes off?
I'll stay just as long as I can. Thank you.
Thank you.
So now I'd go ahead and introduce our consultant team. This is Cascadia Consulting Group, and this will be their second briefing of the Planning Commission. They were here in early September, if you may recall. And since that time, they have produced a draft document talking about some proposed strategies, setting a target for greenhouse gas emission reductions. And so you do have a draft with the strategies and actions that they've come up with so far. And tonight, before this meeting, we had an hour to have folks come in a sort of open house style, look at some of those strategies and actions, and give us their opinions on which they thought had the most merit. So you'll hear a little bit from the consultant about that, as well as giving us a context for what these actions need to be addressing. So I'll go ahead and introduce PJ Tillman, who's our lead consultant, and then she also is assisted by Britton Richardson.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you, everyone. It's nice to see you all again. My colleague Britton Richardson is here in the audience. She can give a little wave. She'll be up later. I will be covering today the progress made since September, as well as some highlights from the public input that we just received. So I want to thank everyone who is still here for providing that input. We'll be able to report some initial thoughts there, and then we'll take, of course, the time to process that in our revisions to the Climate Action Plan. So tonight, Britton and I will cover just a refresher on the purpose, scope, and timeline for this effort. I introduced that in September, but we'll cover it again just quickly. We'll also cover an overview of the climate impacts expected for Everett to set the context for the vision statement and the greenhouse gas emissions reductions targets that we've proposed, as well as the draft goals, strategies, and actions. I want to note at the outset that the strategies and actions that the public commented on beforehand today and that we'll dive into in this presentation are not considered final. They really are a draft, and so we're looking for that input that Councilperson Paul mentioned, Roberts, to revise those and come back to you in December with a proposed final version. So I'm first going to start out with that overview I mentioned. So some of the key things about the purpose and goals for this effort is that we're really looking for that foundation for long-term climate resilience planning. And that means that we're focused at that strategic roadmap level and a platform for future work. So we're looking for strategies and actions that set the city up for systemic long-term change, as well as some of that low-hanging fruit that can be implemented relatively easily and at relatively low cost to continue to build and sustain the momentum that's already in the city around climate action. And then, of course, we're considering the key priorities and concerns of Everett's various communities through the public input processes at these meetings, and then that Karen is facilitating in between the meetings as well. In terms of the focus of the Climate Action Plan, we are still focused on the 4 sectors that I introduced back in September: transportation, electrification and the transition away from natural gas, the green economy, and compact multimodal land use. We've added a 5th sector, which is governance, and that's just essentially about the capacity building that's needed to move any planning process successfully forward, and so those actions will pertain to this effort in particular. I want to note that a couple of the key distinctions for this effort is that since the city is already making a lot of progress around climate adaptation, the plan, which is preparing for really the impacts of climate change that are more or less unavoidable at this point, so it's preparing for what's already here and what's coming. Since the city is already doing a lot of great work in moving that forward, we're really focused on climate mitigation, which is about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So you'll see that reflected in the strategies and actions as well. Also, because the city is already making a lot of progress on climate change, we're generally focused on strategies and actions that pertain to the broader community. So there are things that the city will certainly assist with, but they're focused on operations and endeavors outside of city government for the most part. It's not always true, but that is a focus of this plan. This timeline slide, we are on track. So we are right in the middle there, the October 15th workshop, and on track of where we wanted to be to finish up this climate action plan by the end of the year. So tonight's meeting will focus on providing an overview of the substance of the climate action plan, the draft vision, the draft greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets, and then the draft goals, strategies, and actions for each of those 5 sectors. We'll then take your input and the public input gathered prior to this meeting and in the next few weeks to revise the climate action plan and narrow those strategies and actions to the ones that we're really going to move forward. We'll have that back to you in advance of the December 3rd meeting as a proposed final version of the climate action plan and add in the sections that are currently in your memo. So things like the executive summary and the conclusion. It's not really the meat of the plan, but we can't write them until we know what's in the plan, hence why they're not in your memo just yet. I wanted to provide also a few more details on the approach we've taken to date to get to where we are today. It's essentially composed of a review component and a gathering of input component to pull together the memo that you have with the information in it tonight. So we've reviewed 7 City of Everett planning documents that were recommended by the city team. Things like the water and wastewater plan and the comprehensive plan sustainability element. We've reviewed 3 key state and regional planning documents, the Puget Sound Regional Council's Vision for 2050 around climate change, a state report on how to set up the green economy in the state of Washington, and Snohomish County's municipal plan for sustainability. We also looked at 8 climate action plans from other comparable cities and counties around the Puget Sound region and around the nation. So we are looking there for cities and counties that are comparable in size or in where they're at in their climate action planning process to pull out strategies and actions that would be relevant for the city of Everett. And then to get at the climate impacts that are really most important for Everett, we reviewed the key literature, and the key research summaries for this area and for the region that pertain specifically to Everett. And Britton will go into more detail on that. Paired with that was an input gathering phase. So that includes the conversation that we had back in September and the public input that Karen facilitated and gathered since then. It also includes a survey of city staff where we asked them to evaluate the performance of the existing climate-related strategies and actions they're working on and what they would recommend moving forward into this planning effort. In that survey, we got feedback from 4 departments, from Parks, Facilities, Planning, and Fire. And so that input is incorporated in the strategies and actions you have in front of you today and that we'll go into more detail on later. We got some kind of late-breaking input from 2 other departments, from Transportation and Public Works, and we'll integrate that input into the final version that you'll see prior to December. And so those review of documents and the gathering of input have essentially all gone in to produce the 4 items in the bottom box that have a checkbox next to them. And then the bottom one, executive summary, introduction, and conclusion, that, as I said, is coming later. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Britton to walk us through some of the key climate impacts for Everett.
Thanks, PJ. So why a climate impact or a climate action plan? So to answer this question and to set the stage for the strategies and actions that we'll be recommending in this plan, we're going to take a look at the climate impacts that are facing Everett in particular into the future. So climate change is projected to increase the daily temperature in Snohomish County. So this chart is showing the average daily maximum temperatures in Snohomish County. The gray is showing the historical averages. The red is showing a higher emissions scenario, and the blue is showing a lower emissions scenario. So historically, we've hovered around 53 to 54 degrees Fahrenheit. That's projected to go up to about 58 degrees Fahrenheit by 2050. The average annual temperature in general, so not the daily max, that's supposed to rise 4 to 5 degrees by 2050 compared to 1970 to 1999 averages. So along with this temperature increase, there's also going to be an increase in the number of extreme heat events. So similarly, this chart is showing historical and then what's projected into the future. This is showing days per year with max above 90 degrees Fahrenheit. So you can see that historically we've hovered around 1 day. This is projected to increase to about 4 days per year by 2050. And then 18 days per year under the high emissions scenario by 2100. Climate change is projected to increase the average annual precipitation in Snohomish County, but only slightly. What's really going to happen is seasonal precipitation is going to change dramatically. So we're going to see wetter conditions in the winter, and we'll see drier conditions in the summer. So summers are projected to become 7 to 8% drier by 2050. Winters are projected to become 8 to 9% wetter in 2050. Climate change is projected to increase sea level. So by 2050, this is going to be about 1 to 2 feet in local sea level rise. And this is compared to 1991 to 2009 averages. This will have impacts on coastal flooding, greater storm surges, reduced drainage of river floodwaters, and others. And with this increase in temperature due to climate change, and as less precipitation falls as snow and instead falls as rain, snowpack will be lessened. The less water being stored in the form of snow, ready to melt into rivers at a gradual pace, will mean that streams will see greater volumes in the winter, and they'll see lower volumes in the summer. This can affect flooding that you'll see in the winter. It can affect hydropower and the planning of the energy in the area. And with decreases in snowpack comes increases in stream temperature also. So as I alluded to, there will be increases in flooding with the increases in stream flow and also sea level rise. So one study suggests a 19 to 69% increase in the area flooded by the 2080s. And the reason for this range is just modeling. The different models can come up with different things, and this is also looking at large areas of land, so it depends on the area that you're examining. There's some things that we know with certainty, so there's definitely still planning opportunity there, even with that large band. So this map is showing the inundation risk of the area. The red area is showing high risk for inundation. The orange area is showing medium risk for inundation. And as you can see, that's very close to I-5. It's also very close to railways, so there's some risk there with that flooding. And this is showing a 100-year flooding event. So in summary, in Everett, climate change is anticipated to increase temperatures. It's anticipated to increase annual precipitation, particularly winter precipitation, while summer precipitation will decrease. Sea level is expected to rise. Stream flows will go up in the winter and down in the summer, and that'll come with increases in temperature. Snowpack will be reduced, and then there will be more flooding, particularly during high tide times. And with these climate impacts, we're likely to see impacts on other things like infrastructure, health, and also the economy. So some impacts to infrastructure include transportation closures, delays, or detours when you're seeing large flooding or storm surges. Those kinds of things are expected to be impacted. Wastewater and stormwater collection might be impacted by flooding as well, and saltwater intrusion. There might be increased or decreased access to facilities in ports and any of the infrastructure in that area during storm surge times and damage because of storm surges. And then the wildfire risk in other areas might impact the energy distribution in the city of Everett. So as wildfires increase in the mountainous regions, there might be damage to power generation facilities and transmission lines. Health impacts include greater heat-related workers' compensation claims because of the greater amount of extreme heat events. That also includes more heat-related deaths, particularly for vulnerable populations like those over the age of 65. With increased flooding, there's more biological contamination, so that could lead to contamination of drinking water, stormwater, and other water bodies. And the conditions for disease-carrying vectors will become more favorable, so you might see some of that as well, some increases in those kinds of diseases. So to touch a bit on the economic impacts, there was a statewide study that suggests doing nothing on climate change will cost the state billions in the next century. This will also impact average household costs. So these costs for 2020 equal about 2% of the current median household income in Washington. And the costs will be made up mostly in the form of more expensive energy, increased healthcare costs, reduced food production, and salmon populations, and lost recreation opportunities. And now I'll turn it back over to PJ to talk a bit about Climate Action Plan vision and targets.
Thanks, Britton. I'm just going to put up one of our boards here. Great. Well, there are, as Britton mentioned, a lot of economic and other impacts anticipated with climate change, but in that do-nothing scenario isn't currently the case in the state of Washington. The city of Everett is joined by a lot of other cities, counties, and the state as well to take action on climate change. So while the impacts are serious, people are already taking action. I'm excited to go through with you the vision and targets and strategies and actions that have been proposed so far for the city of Everett. So the vision statement, this is really what is kind of the desired future state? What kind of city are we working toward with this climate action planning process and its implementation? So, where do we want to be by 2050? What kind of place do we want to live in? And to get to this vision statement, as well as the targets that I'll cover next, we considered the input that we heard from you in September, as well as from the public since then. And what we heard is that, there is an interest in Everett leading in climate change, but it's not just about climate change, it's about preserving that robust economy into the future. So that's why this leading statement is emphasizing both Everett being a leader in climate action, as well as continuing to be an economic leader for the region, but focused on the green economy. Some of the details we heard that are important in moving toward this future state for Everett was carbon neutrality. That's already something that is on track with the targets that the city set back in about 2 or 3 years ago. Heard that we want that Everett to continue to be a great place to live and a healthy place to live. We heard that along with a robust local economy, we want to continue to preserve those parks and green spaces and a healthy habitat and environment, and that the actions being taken now are not just for current residents and visitors, but for generations to come. And so that leads us to the details here that we partner with communities and businesses to work towards carbon neutrality, sustain healthy, resilient, and livable communities, preserve the natural environment and a robust local economy, and enhance quality of life for all residents for generations to come. In the open house that preceded the meeting tonight, we got about half a dozen comments you can see on the Post-its here. And the key themes from those are to be stronger and more urgent with this vision statement. So focusing on those elements of green and on the quality of life for not just people, but the environment, fish, wildlife, and other animals. So that's what we were able to glean just from taking a look at these a few minutes ago. Moving on to the targets. The targets, these are really about where do we want to get with greenhouse gas emissions? How much reduction in emissions, which are the cause of climate change, do you want to get to? Cities around the world are establishing similar targets to these to guide their climate action efforts. So what we've proposed here, they typically align with international scientific consensus about what's needed to do worldwide to stem the most significant impacts of climate change anticipated by 2050. So that's generally an 80% reduction in emissions by 2050 is thought to be where we can all need to get on average to stem the worst impacts of climate change. The targets we've recommended for Everett both reaffirm the 2050 target for the city set back in, I think, 2014 or 2016, and are consistent with targets around the region. So for example, Tacoma has a 40% reduction by 2020 for their community-wide, and so community-wide means everything but what the city is doing. So municipal is focused on city operations or county operations, city operations in this case, whereas community means everything else that goes on in a city. Seattle is looking for carbon neutrality by 2050 for their municipal operations. One thing you'll see here, and actually in many climate planning processes, is that municipal targets do tend to be a little bit more aggressive. And some of the reasons for that are that many cities and counties are really looking to lead by example and demonstrate what's possible. Another reason is that while cities are and counties are inherently complicated and there's a lot of moving pieces, they are in a sense a single entity, whereas working in a community typically requires a lot more partnering and capacity building, so things take a little longer to get there. What we heard in the public input before this was essentially do it faster and sooner. That was reflected in almost all of the Post-its you can see down here. So some thought, let's get to carbon neutrality by 2030. Others thought, let's get to carbon neutrality by 2040. I'm going to transition now to introducing the draft goals, strategies, and actions that are in the plan. So we've got the 5 sectors shown here that we've talked about. And I know gave you a detailed memo before this, so the relevant pages of the memo are indicated on each of the slides that follow here. These initial goals, strategies, and actions were developed from a review of the planning documents and the literature that we mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. I want to note now that we did, just a reminder that we did focus on those 2 types of actions, the first being those actions that to support systemic long-term change for the city, and the second type being those lower hanging fruit that can be done sooner at relatively low cost to build and sustain that momentum. Again, these are definitely not final. We're really looking for your input tonight and the input of the public to figure out what to keep, what to change, what to drop. So not all of these will necessarily move forward. That very much depends on what we hear. For that reason, we won't actually share any evaluation of these strategies. So how do they do in terms of impact or cost or affordability? Because we wait for the narrowing of the list and what you all suggest we move forward before getting there. So you won't see that assessment of affordability, feasibility, equity, impact, or co-benefits. That's going to come in our next step, along with suggesting a responsible party to lead each of the actions that also comes later and will be provided to you ahead of the December 3rd meeting with that final, proposed final document. So Britton and I are going to tag team walking through each of these sectors and their strategies and actions in more detail. She's going to cover transportation, electrification, and compact multimodal land use. And then I'll cover the final two and close out the presentation. So I'm going to switch our poster over here and invite Britton back up to cover these first three.
Thank you, PJ. So the first sector that I'll touch on is transportation. Transportation resembles the biggest opportunity for Everett because transportation sector makes up about 54% of the greenhouse gas emissions in the city. So there's a lot of mitigation opportunity here. This section goes hand in hand with the other two sections I'll be talking about, which are the electrification and then the compact multimodal land use section. So to create the transportation transformations we're looking to see, we also need to change land use and also build things like EV charging infrastructure. So these three will go very closely together, as you'll see. The biggest impact in terms of transportation are folks driving their fossil fuel powered cars alone, commuting, and also to do other errands in the city. So we're really focused on embracing non-car travel, so looking at strategies that prioritize, incentivize, and promote transportation of using alternative modes like biking, walking, and public transit. We're also looking at reducing commute trips, so strategies around alternative work schedules and telecommuting options to reduce those travel trips. Our second goal is around transitioning to the use of clean energy efficient vehicles. So when people do have to use their vehicles, we want them to be the most efficient vehicles possible. So this is looking at improving vehicle fuel efficiency, switching to cleaner fuel alternatives, and then transitioning to electric vehicles as well. And some of these things are already happening in the city, so there's a lot of strategies around promoting alternative modes. So we're really building on what the city is already doing for some of those, whereas other things like transitioning to electric vehicles will require a bigger push and will be a more robust strategy moving forward. Oh, I guess I could also touch on the public comment for the transportation. So PJ just pulled it down, but it was showing that promoting alternative modes was very important to the public. Yeah, as you can see, it was outvoted by all of the others. So electrification is the other sector that I'll touch on. This is really focused on moving from natural gas to electricity. So the city relies on electricity that is heavily fueled by hydropower, which makes it fairly clean, whereas natural gas is not as clean. So 36% of the city's emissions come from natural gas, whereas 10% come from electricity. So we really want to move into electricity instead of natural gas fuel. So our first goal is around eliminating natural gas from new and existing buildings. We're thinking about doing this through mandating all electric construction, electrifying city and community facilities, educating the community on fuel switching needs, benefits, and methods. So there's a lot of resources already out there, and we want to just promote education and those behavior changes, and then also incentivizing that fuel switching. Our second goal is around electrifying the transportation system through infrastructure development. So like I said in the transportation section, we want to promote EV adoption, and it's hard to do that when you don't have EV charging infrastructure. So we want to pair these two strategies together to really promote electric vehicles in the city. And through the public comment, it's clear that mandating all electric construction was heavily liked. And then also creating a robust electric vehicle charging station was favored. Thank you, PJ. So the next sector I'm going to talk about is compact multimodal land use. And this is looking at how do we change the land use to incentivize non-car travel? How do we make our communities more walkable and places that we want to stay, live, and work in? So our first goal is around creating centralized activity centers with dense and diverse mix of services, amenities, jobs, and housing types in areas well served by public transit. So this is about really defining how we want to develop and where we want to develop, whereas the second goal is more around creating vibrant, healthy, and livable communities, so places that people want to stay in and live in and enjoy. So for the first goal, some of the strategies are supporting intentional high-density development, and then locating development near transit and discouraging car travel. The second goal, the strategies within that goal are improving neighborhood walkability, and then increasing, protecting, and restoring green spaces and natural areas within the community. And the public was kind of tied on a few of them, but it looks like the winner is increasing, protecting and restoring green spaces and natural areas within the community. But also highly ranked was improving neighborhood walkability and support intentional high-density development. And now I'll turn it over to PJ to talk about green economy.
Right, thank you. So the green economy, it's a little different than the sectors that Britton was just going over, because this is really more about the systemic long-term change that I was speaking about in terms of types of actions. Everett is certainly a city that has it has a strong, robust local economy. It's got educational institutions that excel at workforce training. We're looking to build on those kinds of things that Everett is already good at to move toward being a green economy hub of the future. So what do we mean by green economy? That's one question here. That means things like local living wage green jobs. It means those jobs may be in cutting edge sectors that continue to position Everett as a manufacturing leader. It means widespread sustainable business practices throughout the city, and a robust local circular economy. And that's essentially kind of keeping resources within the city and minimizing the amount of things coming into and out of the city, which not only supports a resilient and robust local economy, but reduces the emissions from transporting goods and services into and out of cities. Provided that the education, workforce training, and business assistance are in place to facilitate this transition, the city's industrial and manufacturing sectors really stand to benefit from this type of transition. Similarly, by using resources more efficiently and promoting reuse and repair over buying new, crucial reductions in those emissions from transporting goods and services and from consuming goods and services can be realized. So these great green economy strategies, this first one here is really about setting Everett up for that systemic long-term change. And it covers not just kind of the standard economic items around manufacturing or jobs, but broadens out into things like green infrastructure. And this is really about setting the city up to get there. The second goal, preparing Everett residents for jobs in the green economy, this is really about making sure that the jobs stay in Everett, and that Everett can continue to have a robust local economy. I know a lot of people drive in to Boeing, but Boeing is kind of technically outside of the city parameters. So this is about providing the workforce training and the higher education that trains people here in Everett and near Everett, so that the jobs are here in the city for a long time. And then lastly, promoting the local circular economy. This is kind of about how you do your day-to-day errands and how you pick up things you need for home or work, and making that more local. So this is things like tool sharing libraries. This is things like making it easier to have an urban garden. It's things like supporting the ability for farmers markets and the local agriculture that comes from outside of the city to be in the city and purchased by residents. The public input on that, let me cover that real quick. You can kind of see, thank you, Britton, for holding these up. We have more strategies here than others, and there's pretty much a tie between 4 of them. Incentivizing green infrastructure, recruiting and supporting green business and industry, the sharing and reuse economy, and supporting local agriculture and small business. Those 4 really rose to the top. And lastly, on governance. So this one is really about providing the foundation and the capacity building that any planning process needs. It's focused on strengthening both city and community capacity to support climate action. So that includes things like supporting capacity building, knowledge, kind of people being fluent in the language of climate change and wherever its greatest opportunities are. It includes leveraging the work that partner organizations and individuals are already doing to move this work forward. And it includes considering the distribution of costs and benefits or the equity of actions and everything that happens. And so in the public input here, what really rose to the top was partnering with other governments and organizations to move the work forward and that equitable climate action. So to conclude, we'll take the input that we hear this evening from you all, as well as from the public input in the open house and other input that comes over the next couple weeks to revise the core content we've gone over this evening and prepare the full, complete draft, final climate action plan, that's a mouthful, for you. We'll have it to you by November 22nd so that we can discuss it in the December 3rd Planning Commission meeting and associated public hearing. With that, I'd like to thank you very much for your time and attention. I know we covered a lot, and see if you all have any questions for us.
Thank you, PJ. Thank you, Britton. That was very well done. Anyone have questions for either? We're absorbing.
Yeah.
That's a lot. You guys have been busy. Commissioner Zelinski?
Not a question, just an observation. I think it'll be important for the final product to kind of identify the menu of things that can be done by the city as an organization, by individual households and residents, what they can do, and then by individual businesses too, what they can do. So I think it would be helpful to, I don't know, maybe you're already thinking in those terms, but it's just an observation.
Yeah, that will happen in the form of delineating clearly what is a action that the city does and what is an action that is more around the city, or excuse me, in the community. And then we are also proposing individual leads for each of the actions. So you'll see that in the final version.
And a section specific to what residents can do. So a nice call out on specific actions that homes can take and what you can do as a resident.
Commissioner Tisdale?
Will these be lined or aligned with, if we're going to electrify more homes and take natural, is it going to be aligned with the power grids, and how is all of that going to be there so that they can actually be achieved? Or
Like the transition from natural gas to electricity and like that
Yeah.
increase in demand.
Or
Yeah,
more.
this plan won't go in depth on that kind of analysis, but the utilities should be thinking about this kind of thing in their long-range planning. So if they see that we have a published plan that's talking about a lot of EV infrastructure and switching from natural gas, that's something that they should be considering. Yeah.
And I think to build on that, we will be evaluating things like feasibility and affordability. That's our next step. But the step after that, as we understand it, is that the city council takes the full planning document and identifies, kind of prioritizes what to take on first versus what to push down the line. And once a smaller set of priorities is selected, that's where the resources most likely to really dive into things like detailed cost-benefit analyses and necessary partnerships to develop right away, although we'll provide the ideas for that. But there are a lot of nuts and bolts that are really most appropriate to dig into typically once it's identified what's going to be worked on first. So we'll provide the starting information, the starting place for that, and then that'll continue as you all work on implementation.
What format will public outreach and public education take?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it depends a bit on what we hear in terms of input, in terms of like what actions and strategies rise to the top. Some of the current actions are everywhere from informational materials, so just getting kind of the word out, awareness raising, to providing things like technical assistance for business owners to transition to more sustainable or green practices, including away from natural gas, more green space. It kind of depends. And then it could include things like where to go get additional workforce training if you're someone who lives in Everett or has recently moved here and wants to make sure you've got a job in the future. Where can you go for that education? So it kind of depends on what ends up in the plan. But those are some examples that are currently in there.
Do you have any go-to strategies in terms of public outreach formats that you lean towards that seem effective?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I do a lot of public outreach and engagement. Definitely all those things need to be tailored to the specific community and focused first and foremost on what's trying to be achieved with that outreach and engagement. But some general tenets around outreach engagement are to involve the public early and often, and to the extent possible to have them shape the direction of whatever it is you're talking about. It tends to lead to a greater sense of ownership, a more resilient, robust effort, whatever it may be, and it tends to be more efficient as well in implementation. So does that start to answer the question? Are you looking for kind of tried and true methods?
I know that each community that you serve is probably very unique, but I think ultimately when it comes down to it, people operate in similar ways all over the region. So in the past, have there been any particularly successful outreach strategies, ways that you really saw the response when you threw out your net?
Yeah, I can start and then do you want?
You're the outreach expert.
Okay. So yeah, I think there are some, and it depends on the capacity people have. So those who have more time and energy, you might identify for something like a resident advisory committee. So they're really representing a broader sector of their community and helping partner with the city and other organizations to move key elements of something forward. It's really about meeting people where they are. So if people have less time and interest, it might be commenting on an email here and there. It might be providing materials in multiple languages. It might be, it may be being present at places where people already congregate. So places like farmers markets and community centers, and really focusing on those relationships with existing community liaisons. So, and those aren't necessarily environmental. Like that involves working with food banks, working with YMCA and Boys and Girls Clubs, because ultimately sustainability and environmental action is an integrated thing. Like it reduces stressors across the community and introduces benefits across the community. So it makes sense to use existing strong relationships in the community to gather public input from those who don't have a lot of time and to help move those things forward. And to the extent possible, compensating your local liaisons for that work is really helpful because they tend to be very resource constrained.
Thank you.
That's great.
Any other questions? Commissioner Tisdale?
This city is probably not unlike any other, but a lot of our working population, of half or more of it, doesn't live in the city. So they're coming from Lake Stevens, or they're coming from Marysville, or someplace else where they don't have a climate action. I don't see anything in here about traffic congestion. How are we going to, I know from being on Puget Sound Air's board that air pollution out of automobiles is where we can get the biggest bang for our buck. I didn't really see anything in here about, addressing that issue in any way to, that's real, it's gonna happen, it's gonna be going on. So if we're going to do this inside the city, how are we gonna address those, how are we gonna address it for those that commute? And, it's, no one wants to address it, everybody wants to turn their head, but we've got to have more road capacity. Just go up I-5, those folks don't live in Everett, they're going through Everett as an example. And we get all the odors that come out of their car,
Right.
as well as from a health standpoint, but also from the CO2. The efficiency of the automobile is pretty poor at 0 to 5 miles an hour, and again, I didn't see anything in here to address.
Yeah, so in the transportation section, if you flip to, I forget what page of the memo it is, but there are a few actions related to reducing the commute trips, so focusing on telecommuting and really inspiring that within the business community, and also providing incentives for businesses to provide to their employers, or their employees, to commute or use public transit, those kinds of things, so reduced bus pass or something like that, so that you're impacting the people that are commuting to the community through their work and their employers, so that you can capture some of that. But yes, it's a challenge to get the people that are commuting in.
I
and
saw
don't
what you're
live
talking
there.
about, but again, it's at capacity. How do you make that traffic flow better to reduce greenhouse gases?
Yeah, like more of a land use change.
Because some people sit in their car hour to 2 hours a day each way of the commute, and it's just one of those things that it's real, it's here.
I think that's the golden question. The one we're all searching for.
Thank you.
Are there other questions that commissioners have of? So I just want to say that I really like how you outlined all the goals. I think they're very thorough and they're terrific, and I like how you received feedback at the workshop, and I was pleased to see it was so well attended. And I understand that you're going to be getting in a little bit to the cost-benefit analysis, which will help us all a little bit in terms of how we prioritize these things. And I wanted to address Commissioner Zielinski, or was it Tisdale? It was Tisdale. So one of the things I do like about this is that you identify partners as being incredibly important. And I just want to mention that SNOPUD actually did reach out to us at the very early stages of this process to say how much they supported it. And they looked forward to working with the city on what emerged out of this. So I'm sure that that is something we'll be hearing from other partners from within this area as well. So thank you.
Yeah,
It was
great.
wonderful having
I'm
you.
glad people are reaching out already, so we'd love to hear that. Thank you. Thank you.
All right. So without further ado, I think we're going to be launching into item number 2, which is a public hearing.
Public comment on that.
Oh, sorry. Oh, thank you. So good I have commissioners, and I apologize. I wanted to find out, I didn't receive any signups. Is there anyone in the audience that would like to speak on agenda item number 1 at this time? Please come forward, and if you don't mind, state your name and address into the microphone. And when you're finished, if you haven't done so already, please give your sign-up sheet to Kathy.
Oh, okay. My name is Pam Kepford. I live at 5621 Rockefeller Avenue for the last 40 years. I'm also with 350 Everett, your local climate action group. And I have to applaud Karen, for the tremendous job of outreach she did both, she left. But anyway, she did a great job. She came to 350, presented to our group twice, and also know she went out to the neighborhoods, and I'm really admire the effort she made. Also, it was nice to see that so many of the citizens' suggestions that I heard actually appeared in the pages we looked at today, so it was really nice to actually see those ideas in play. There was one of these things that said city staff should be appointed and take it upon themselves to learn about climate change. But I would also like city council members and any council members to make this a lifetime assignment to understand more about climate change and the ins and outs. I know you're all busy people and have other areas of interest, but this is the existential issue of our times. And I'd really like to think that people in our government understand a lot more than I think they do right now. I've been doing this for decades, and we were like the voice screaming in the wilderness, and now all of a sudden climate change is the thing, and there's an awful lot of people that are trying to come up to speed pretty fast. Anyway, I'd like to mention Greta Tunberg. She's the 16-year-old girl that a year ago started sitting outside the Swedish parliament. She brought the youth of the world to their feet, and to the streets. This month's global climate action was, they couldn't count them. There's between 4 and 7 million people came out of the streets of cities all over the world about climate change. There were even 300 people here in Everett at the county courthouse on that day. So the move is afoot. The tidal wave is upon us in terms of action. And speaking of action, in closing, I'd like to quote Robert Browning, one of my favorite poets. And he says, "A man's reach should exceed his grasp." These are words from a poem by Robert Browning, suggesting that to achieve anything worthwhile, a person should attempt even those things that may turn out to be impossible. So I would like to encourage the commission to think big, reach, grasp. We may not make it, but if we don't reach for it, we certainly will not make it. Thank you very much for your attention and for this wonderful effort that's underway in the city.
Oh, Chair Beck, if I may.
You may.
I forgot to, it's been a long day. My mind's running a little slow. I do have one quick question for the consultants. Throughout this is an excellent presentation, a lot of fantastic material, but one thing I noticed, and maybe this isn't the point in time where we address it, but there is no discussion around, the impact that these policies will have on traditionally marginalized communities who have traditionally borne the brunt of, our carbon-intensive economy. Is there going to be any further analysis of what we can do to make sure we're addressing this with equity in mind?
Yes. Did you?
No,
Okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, equity is one of the criteria by which we'll evaluate every strategy and action. And so that will carry equal weight to the other. Right now it's proposed to carry equal weight to the other criteria. So that's one key way that we're addressing it. There is currently one equity-focused action in there, and then there are others that consider equity in how those actions are structured. But we take that point that there may be some ways for us to make some of the other actions more equitable. So if you have some specific ideas on what would work well in Everett, we would love to hear them.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any other members of the audience that would like to speak to item number 1?
I'm Kent Beverly, 312 Pix Drive. I didn't know about the workshop early this afternoon, so I'm a little puzzled about the outreach. Also, as I was working outside my lawn today, or yard, I think I saw Prime trucks go by about 3 times, each stopping at a different residence and making only one delivery. We've got a warehouse right here in Everett. I've seen multiple vehicles stacked up on Casino Road ready to get on to Evergreen as they start their day. So I hope that the action plan will take into account the trend toward internet commerce that depends heavily on transportation for delivery services. Also, probably part of your equity comment, it was noted this week in the news that 2 tribes would like to take out 3 dams. So how are you going to balance that out? I don't envy the recommendations to be made to you and to the city council when it comes to how do we save the salmon and the orcas and increase our electrical consumption. Thank you.
Any other person who'd like to speak to item number 1? And I just want to add at this time, too, that we are going to stick with a 3-minute time limit, and folks have been very good about that so far, but because there is such a large agenda tonight that we're going to limit folks to 3 minutes in terms of comments. Thank you.
Tina Hokinson, 325 South Cabot. 2 quick things. One is that the Snow Isle Food Co-op is certified as a B Corp, and that's a corporation that is people, planet, and profit. So I'd like to see more B Corp businesses in Everett. We've got, I think, 2, at the last time I looked, 2 in Snohomish County. And this is a worldwide certification. The other thing, I found an interesting website called drawdown.org. And I just ask everyone to kind of take a look at that and see what the options are there for addressing climate change. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else to speak to item number 1? Please come forward.
Hi. Planning Commissioner Tristel, I believe, asked a question to the fine ladies who were up here earlier regarding what they plan to do about congestion. And I have maybe a suggestion, which is that maybe if we had more housing or moderate to low income housing in our community, that would reduce congestion, because a lot of Everett, both North Everett and South Everett, have primarily, our largest industry is service industry jobs. And those are middle to low income, but those folks can't afford to live in our neighborhoods primarily. So if they didn't have to commute, then that would reduce congestion. So thank you.
Thank you. Is there anybody else that would like to speak to item number 1? Okay. Seeing nobody else, we will go ahead and move on to item number 2, which is a public hearing for supportive housing and single-family zones. Alan?
Good evening, Alan Giffen, Planning Director.
Oh, if I may, I would like to recuse myself from this portion of the Planning Commission, and I'll be stepping back from the dais during the discussion. And so I just wanted to make that public, and I'll be stepping back now. Thank you.
So tonight is a public hearing, potential decision meeting for the Planning Commission on a recommendation to the City Council concerning supportive housing. The City Council enacted a moratorium on June 12th on supportive housing within single-family zones in the city. And within single-family zones, the code that they placed a moratorium upon allows supportive housing only on publicly owned properties. There have been a number of workshops and a public hearing also before the City Council in which they referred a number of items to the Planning Commission for consideration in whether or not to amend the code. Planning Commission has held 2 public workshops, and tonight is a public hearing. Staff is not making any recommendations concerning the whether or not to maintain the current code or to eliminate from the code the potential for supportive housing in single-family zones. We have prepared, however, 2 alternative recommendations. Alternative 1 would eliminate supportive housing as a permitted use in single-family zones, and alternative 2 would maintain that possibility within single-family zones but only on publicly owned properties. And along with either of those actions, there are some companion amendments to the code, and I'll walk through those before you get into the public hearing portion of the meeting tonight. So with alternative 1, eliminating supportive housing as a permitted use in single-family zones, supportive housing would be allowed only then in multiple family and commercial zones, but would be regulated, at least by staff's recommendation, as multifamily housing. Currently, we have a separate land use category for supportive housing, and the recommendation, if you eliminate it from single-family zones, well, actually, in both cases, would be in the multifamily and commercial zones to regulate supportive housing only as multifamily housing. Again, supportive housing would not be allowed in single-family zones. We are recommending, in either case, a definition of supportive housing being amended to use the definition that was established in the state legislature earlier this year. For this alternative, no public notice would be provided for supportive housing, and again, that would only be possible for supportive housing in multifamily zoning or commercial zoning, unless the project was large enough that it triggered a SEPA review, which in our code would be more than 60 dwelling units. The review of supportive housing as a multifamily use would be by city staff during the land use project review, and neither the hearing examiner nor the city council would be involved in reviewing the project. The special regulations in EMC 1939-155 would be eliminated, so there would be no requirement for a management plan for supportive housing in multifamily or commercial zones. There would be no requirement for proximity to a transit stop. There would be no requirement for supportive housing to be located near services that would be needed by residents. By definition, supportive housing does provide services on site. Perhaps not every service that a resident would need, however. There would be no requirement for sidewalk improvements except as required for the multifamily development. And in most cases, multifamily projects, when constructed, do require full frontage improvements, including sidewalks, but typically not beyond the frontage of the project site. Building height and density would be the same as required for multifamily housing. The off-street parking requirement under either alternative would be amended to require a parking study. The parking standard would read, as determined by planning director and city engineer, and when that part of the code is triggered, then that does require a parking study be provided by usually a traffic or transportation engineer who has expertise in the subject. Then through that process, it would be possible to reduce the parking standard to what the current standard is under the current code of 1 per 4 bedrooms plus 1 per every 2 employees on shift, but that would require some analysis of the needs and the likelihood of residents to be own vehicles or be driving. There would be no special requirements for compatibility with the surrounding neighborhood other than those that are required by the zoning code for multifamily housing. The requirements for on-site open space would be the same as required for multifamily housing in a multifamily or commercial zone. Alternative 2 would maintain supportive housing as a permitted use in single-family zones, but only on publicly owned land. And as we have discussed in previous meetings, that would amount to, in all likelihood, not more than about 4 sites in the entire city that would likely transition from public ownership to be surplus for another purpose. Supportive housing would still be allowed in multifamily and commercial zones, but would be regulated as multifamily housing. In single-family zones, supportive housing would continue to be reviewed by the hearing examiner. A written management plan would be required as part of the application for review by the hearing examiner. In single-family zones, the proponent of the supportive housing would have to hold a public meeting with the surrounding neighborhood prior to filing a land use application with the city. And that would follow standard city notification procedures to property owners within 500 feet, and a minimum of 15 days prior to a neighborhood meeting. The definition of supportive housing, again, would be enacted the same as enacted through state legislation earlier this year. which changes the title from supportive housing to permanent supportive housing, and the definition is contained later on in the packet. The special regulations in EMC 1939-155 would be amended to apply only in single-family zones and no longer in the multifamily or commercial zones. The required distance to a transit stop would increase from 500 feet to 1/4 mile walking distance, that's 1,320 feet, and pedestrian access to the transit stop must be available on a sidewalk or other safe walking path. There would be no requirement for supportive housing to be located near services that may be needed by residents. Again, by definition, supportive housing does provide services on site. Building height would be the same as required for single-family housing. Building density would be determined by the hearing examiner during the public review process based on criteria for compatibility, including the consideration of the relationship of the proposed site and buildings with context and scale of buildings within the immediately surrounding neighborhood. I'm not going to repeat the parking standard that I mentioned a moment ago, but it would be the same as described for alternative 1. And the requirements for on-site open space would be determined by the hearing examiner during the public review process. Now, as I mentioned, there are 2 resolutions in your packet, one for changing it from the current code to not allow supportive housing in single-family zones. One alternative resolution would maintain the current allowance for public supportive housing on publicly owned lands in single-family zones. There's a background information packet that takes up several pages here, that part of which includes relevant comprehensive plan policies that are a requirement for amending the code. Any code amendment must be consistent with the policies, the relevant policies of the comprehensive plan, and so those have been provided in your background packet. And staff has also offered some comments on the options that were identified by the Planning Commission as preferences at the September 17th public workshop. I won't read through those, but they're fairly detailed comments that responded to the criteria that the City Council referred to the Planning Commission in their public hearing. And so unless you have questions for me, well, I'll pause there and see if you have questions for me, and then I'd recommend that you open up the public hearing.
So my apology, I probably should have asked earlier if there's anyone on the Planning Commission who would like to recuse themselves because they have some sort of conflict of interest on this particular item. If not, then do you have any questions for Alan at this point?
Alan, question for you. Under that alternative 1, it says, it's bullet 4, no public notice would be provided unless the size of it is, over 60 units or all that. Do you mean no advance public notice? I mean, normally if you get an application, you do a notice of application, or is that not the case for something that's allowed outright, not subject to environmental review?
There is a notice of application. There would not be that's a general notice that we provide for any type of land use application that is typically published or on our website, but we don't send mailed notice unless the project is large enough to trigger the SEPA threshold. In this case, that would be 60 dwelling units or more.
Thank you.
Any other questions? I have a point of clarification right now. Commissioner Finch is actually a voting member at this juncture, is he not? Yes. Okay. So, I just noticed you don't have...
I think everyone is this evening. We're missing 2 regular commissioners, so.
I thought so.
Yeah.
The reason I was asking is I'm noticing, is there a microphone? Oh, sorry. Any other questions here? Okay, with this, we'll go ahead and open the public hearing. Once again, I want to mention that we do have a fair number of folks that have signed up for the hearing. So we will be limiting comments to 3 minutes. So you will see up here that there are lights that appear when you begin to speak. When you see the yellow one, you have about 30 seconds before you'll see the red one. And I will try to intervene because when we get the red one, we also get a very disturbing sound. So you'll probably see me going like this over here. I'd also like to mention, let's be respectful to each other. When people come to the podium, please no shoutings of support or discontent. Public speaking is often very difficult for folks, so we want to make sure we're taking the time to hear everyone. So if you do have comments that you would like to make, I'd encourage you at this time to go and sign up and give your form to Kathy, and we'd love to hear from you at the podium. And without further ado, Christopher Anderson, please come to the podium. State your name and address, please.
Hello, my name's Chris Anderson. I live at 3211 Grand Avenue in the Port Gardner neighborhood. I'm here to support Alternative 2, maintaining the current zoning code in the city. Our conversation should not be about property values. A 2008 Furman Center study looked at what 7,500 units of supporting housing did to property values, and it was very little to nothing. They said, we find that the opening of a supportive housing development does not have a statistically significant impact on the value of properties within 500 feet. There was also no difference between low and high density neighborhoods and between large and small supportive housing developments. While property values had a small drop initially, about 2%, they recovered all value within 3 years. I've read more studies and they all say pretty much similar to that. The preponderance of evidence shows that the conversation shouldn't be about property values, but what we should be talking about is whether poor people are welcome in all of our neighborhoods. Half of sci-fi dystopia films have giant concrete walls between the lower and upper classes, and we say that's bad, and yet we do that with zoning, and no one cares about that. It's not different just because it's invisible walls and it's done through bureaucracy. This ordinance and this zoning code is a small exception into those barriers, and it's only been used a couple times in the 3 years it's been available. As one of our staff members here said, I guess there's only 4 other places it can be used. The effects are small for this and shouldn't be rolled back. Our communities and laws should be getting more accepting of poor people, not less. Thank you.
Thank you. Jim Dean, please come to the podium.
Hi, my name is Jim Dean, and I live at 3222 Grand Avenue, and I'm here today in a unique position. I'm a member of the Port Gardner neighborhood, live about two and a half blocks from the site that we're interested in, some of the folks in the work here. My wife works at Claire's Place, which is the permanent supportive housing that we have built on public land, and I happen to work as trying to find places for families who are living in a homeless shelter for a place to stay after they leave that shelter. The challenge we all face is that doesn't exist in lots and lots of ways in our community, and we need so much more. The strength of the changes that I see coming from this, from what our previous is the role of the hearing examiner in looking at that, to look at all the projects. I think the other one, the written management plan, is a way for us to know, and for the city to know, that they've really designed a plan and a method to make sure that they're thinking about their neighborhood at the same time they're thinking about their clients and the work they're doing. It's only going to be held on public land, and I think the idea of having a public meeting beforehand is critically important. I think there needs to be probably a lot more than just one public meeting beforehand as this particular facility is designed and put together. Even in the construction time, people get frustrated by how things happen and what goes on. And when after the construction, the opening takes place, it still needs to be a group that's working with their community to figure out how to take care of the community as well as their own clients and the work that they do. In this plan, building heights and other overlays and other zoning stuff all are part of that. I think that the density that needs to come into this is really taken care of in this second, and that's important too in off-street parking. Always a challenge in any construction is one that I've seen at Claire's Place with 65 units. They still don't fill up about a dozen parking spaces. So it's amazing to see as I'm driving there to do that. The other reason why it's important we pay attention to this is a model for other cities. We are the first one going through this process, but all the other cities in the county are looking to us, and what we decide to do here now will be the model that other cities will follow. And that concerns me because other cities have different other open spaces. Second is, there's a need for all kinds of housing in this community, and one of the things we need to know in your work is, in fact, that we're going to end up having an impact on all kinds of housing, and including single-family housing, if we're going to meet the needs of our community in the future. So we're going to get impacted no matter what. And I think we need to take a look at this and make sure that we save this opportunity for us to really have quality programs that are taking care of our neediest people with effective work between the government and the nonprofit sector and the community. Thank you.
Thank you. Earl Hall, could you please come to the podium?
Yeah, I'm Earl Hall, 3425 Colby Avenue. I'm also speaking in favor of alternative 2. If I had my own personal wish, I wish it'd be on more than just publicly owned property, but the key thing I think is the management plan. There's going to be 24-hour, or there should be 24-hour supervision and stuff. That's going to provide a whole lot more protection to the neighborhood than just putting in multi-use housing. So we're looking at the neighborhood. I think also we are setting an example for the cities around us, and even though we may only have 4 places here, who knows what else is available in other cities in the county. Thank you.
Thank you. Camille Hardin?
Hello, again. My name's Camille Hardin. I live at 3211 Grand Avenue. Just real quick, as what this gentleman was saying, I went to our Port Garner community meeting just the other day, and they're almost completely full up on police officers, and they're going to assign more people to patrol our community. So that's happening. They're doing it. They're looking into it. I feel like everyone did a very good job. I also support supportive housing. I've heard a lot of my neighbors talk about their concerns. I don't see a lot of them here today, which is surprising, but their concerns are either economic or demographic. And economically, they're worried that their property values will go down. Heavens forbid, considering that since 2013, they have gone up an average of 8% every year. So they're about, 43%? They've gone up 43% since 2018. I got that from the Herald, so I believe it's correct. And that there's no real evidence that shows, like Christopher was saying, that low-income housing reduces overall property values. I mean, we all saw what happened to Seattle, and since they had their housing boom in, the 80s and 90s, their property values went down. Am I right? Sorry, sarcasm. And then as far as demographics, I was still a child when the AIDS crisis was going on, but I feel like I see a lot of correlation between people demonizing low-income folks, and we do see that as a real concern in our community, that we've seen more and more homeless folks in our neighborhood, and everyone's talking about how do we fix this problem. I would consider it an epidemic. And when we moralize an epidemic like we did with the AIDS, if you are gay, then you deserve what you get. If you are poor, you deserve what you get. Then I think that future generations will find that abhorrent and disgraceful, and that we should not be thinking about city planning in terms of morality. So, thank you.
Thank you. James Ivory.
Hello, my name is James Ivy. I live at 3221 Norton Avenue, and I'm here to speak against the project. Across the street from me is a Housing Hope facility on the corner of 33rd and Norton. There's a second one at the corner of 35th and Norton, and this proposal would add a third at the corner of 37th and Norton, with a possibility of one at 35th and Grand on another piece of property that the school district owns. But I think that we should look at this issue in the framework of what it is about and what it isn't about. This isn't about not wanting to house the homeless. This isn't whether to house the homeless, it's where. This isn't about discrimination. No one is being discriminated against based on their race, their gender, their religion, sexual orientation, or socioeconomic status. What this is about is whether the commission can answer yes to two simple questions. One, does the commission believe that 3 transitional housing facilities in 1 residential neighborhood is appropriate? And 2, does the site selected provide the best opportunity to serve the largest number of students in the most effective manner possible? In my opinion, the commission needs to answer yes to both of those questions in order for this particular project to go forward. Finally, I'm reminded of the words of a hymn, and those words are, "If everyone lights just one little candle, what a bright world this would be." Now might be the time for other neighborhoods in the city of Everett to stand up and light their candles so that they can participate in providing a brighter future for our homeless population. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm going to apologize if I mispronounce this name. It's Ted Moshart. Moshart?
Ted Moshart, 1112 Clinton Place. So when thinking about supportive housing in a single-family neighborhood, the question is, what's our vision of the city and how to balance the issue of housing while maintaining the integrity of the city? I'm really concerned with the talk and idea of doing away with single-family neighborhoods. That's not what we're dealing with here per se, but I know in Olympia, and it's a discussion about doing away with single-family neighborhoods. My wife and I moved to Rucker Hill because of its historic nature. We live in a 112-year-old house. We're one of 5 families that have owned the house. We love the house, and we purposefully moved to Everett because we like the historical neighborhood. As you know, I work with homeless people, so I'm passionate and supportive of homeless housing. But in this regard, for planning, if this ordinance passes, how do we conceive of the issue of planning, the big picture of planning? All open areas are fair game. Things become helter-skelter in my idea if you're going to support supportive housing in R1 neighborhoods. I'm against putting supportive housing in R1 neighborhoods. Norton Playfield no better illustrates this. The proposal is to put not 5, not 10, not 20, but 50 homes in the most historic, quiet, quaint neighborhood in Everett. It's the wrong place. The Cocoon House did it the right way. High density, above-board process. It's in a busy commercial zone, but it fits into the fabric of our community. At the last meeting, I was pleased to hear that you did your research to look into supportive housing in non-R1 zone areas in Everett. I was really pleased to hear that there are, I think, 20 acres of public land in non-R1 neighborhoods in Everett. I think that's correct. I might be wrong. The school district owns 10 acres in Eastmont, which is next to Costco, right on a bus line, not in an R1 neighborhood, not in a historic neighborhood, right place for this project. And my hope is this doesn't pass and we start fresh and we have a public meeting and do it above board and do this process the right way. Thank you.
Thank you. Ken Reese? Great. I'm trying.
Hi, Ken Reese. I'm at 3427 Norton. My story is pretty close to Ted's. I moved to Everett from a rural part of the county about 5 years ago. We moved into the Rucker Hill neighborhood specifically because of the historic nature or character. We're specifically looking for a historic home to renovate, and 4 years later and a lot of money and a lot of blood and sweat and tears later, it's finally done. Anyway, one of the criteria, well, there were several criteria we placed in buying a new home. One was walkability, which, great, we checked that one off. You can walk to anywhere in the city from Rucker Hill. The other was the open space. The playfield, open space, call it what you will, went into our factoring in to buy in that particular location in that particular home. So when we first moved in there, first couple of years, there were kids that practiced baseball, soccer, all kinds of sports activities. Recently, since the trespassing signs have gone up in the last 2 years, it's mostly folks like myself who take their dogs up there to let them have a little bit of running room. It is maintained by the school district. They do a nice job of maintaining, an open space. There's a nice stand of trees on the east side of it. As we're working through our climate action plan, I would sure hate to see Everett, a tree city, value those trees any less than they would habitat for other folks. So I'm in favor of the green space. I guess I'm coming down on the side of alternative one. I didn't hear all of the parts and pieces of that, but I'm definitely not coming down in support of having R1 be used for supportive housing. As James and I think it was just my neighbor James had mentioned, we do have the 2 housing hope units. I live diagonally across from Windermere Crossing, and they've been pretty good neighbors. We knew they were there when we bought, so we had eyes wide open. No problem. I've met a lot of those folks that live there over the years, and generally very nice people. So this isn't a demographic thing. I am just coming down on the side of preserving green space, providing open space. As we're building more and more along the Rucker corridor, as well as along the Colby corridor, I think having open space for kids to play is important. There's I believe it's about 100+ apartment building that's about to open on the corner of 38th and Rucker. You can correct me if I'm wrong on the numbers, but it looks to be about that size. Those kids are going to need to have a place to play too. As one of the other neighbors had mentioned, the other park in our area, Doyle Park, is owned by the Everett School District. There is no long-term commitment to keeping that as a park.
I'm going to have to let you know that 3 minutes has passed, and
Okay.
I apologize. But
Great.
thank you for your comments.
All right, thank you. Thanks for your time.
Fred Safstrom, please come to the podium.
Fred Safstrom, 717 Grand Avenue. I'm speaking in support of Alternative 2. I compliment the planning department in your work, in your analysis, and your recommendations. I think that the recommendations that are before you in Alternative 2 are an improvement from the existing ordinance. I think one item I want to particularly compliment is the building density. I know that that's been a topic of discussion and is something we've looked at in terms of developing a site. And when there is flexibility in the building densities, it provides a lot more ability for a developer to design a project that would be more sensitive to a neighborhood. For this particular Norton site, as an example, one side is bordering R1, another side is bordering R3 and R4. In developing that site, it would make sense, I believe, to have higher densities on the R3 and R4 side and lower densities on the R1 side. This proposal permits that and would allow a development to be created there to maximize open space and to have the building faces on Norton be as consistent as possible with the existing neighborhood. So thank you very much, and that would be my comments.
Thank you. Okay. Mark Smith?
Mark Smith. My office is at 2827 Rockefeller. I actually live in the city of Linwood. I'm the executive director of the Housing Consortium of Everett and Snohomish County. We've done a number of studies, and there is a housing crisis not only in Everett, but throughout the county. And one of the primary reasons is we're running out of land, period. The suburban single-family lifestyle. I own a suburban single-family home in Linwood, but I've lived in both very dense multifamily housing and the single-family home that I own now. Right? That lifestyle is more and more difficult to sustain. And the reality is that in both places, both the multifamily and the single family that I live in now, I've had good neighbors and I've had bad neighbors in both. People often ask me, so I'm here to speak in favor of Alternative 2. People often ask me, why don't we have more affordable housing? Right? What's this right here? This is why we don't have more affordable housing. Okay? It's when good people, and I do mean that sincerely, good people get together and they express concerns about change, and those concerns turn into fear. And the fear looms larger than anything anybody can say. Poverty is not a moral failure. Poor people are not bad people. They're people who need some help. And that help comes in the form of affordable housing. That is the foundation upon which people build better lives. We need to embrace different land use patterns if we're going to accommodate future population growth, not only in the city of Everett, but throughout the county. We need to embrace more density. We need to embrace all different types of housing. The last thing I'd like to say, because I believe this is a humanitarian issue, the thing about property values, there's multiple studies, property values don't go down when single-family homes are sited next to multifamily affordable housing. BC Housing just released a study that shows that property values don't go down. You got good neighbors, you got bad neighbors. It's not the type of housing, right? But the last thing I would want to say on the humanitarian side is if you could bring the future residents of that housing in here, could you really look a child in the eye and say, I'm sorry, honey, that you live in your car, but we don't want you in our neighborhood? Because that's what this is about. And that's what we can't say. Thank you.
Thank you. So I have gone through all the folks who have signed up. If there's other folks who would like to come to the podium at this time. I see some folks moving. Yeah, please state your name and address at the podium and just give your sheet to Kathy.
Andrea Tucker, 3330 Wetmore Avenue. I just wanted to say that nothing addresses the historic overlay that exists in the Norton project. And I wonder if that's a consideration with any of these proposals. I see elements in both of the proposals that I'm in favor of, and but of course not necessarily in favor of the Norton project. We heard on the transportation, on the climate change comments that green space, preserve green space, keep green space, and also transportation. And when you lose your green space and you lose your neighborhoods, when we talk about single-family neighborhoods, I know I'm going all over the board, I'm nervous, but as a realtor, I've worked with hundreds of people that their dream is to live in a single-family neighborhood. And sometimes when they achieve their dreams, it makes them very happy, and they live to get to a single-family neighborhood. So there's no humanitarian saying that we look homeless children in the eye and say, oh, you can't live here. People live for their dreams, and everybody has a different dream and a different hope. And the people that moved to near the Norton Park, that was their dream and their hope. So I'm not a person that generalizes. I look at all different issues. When we talk about supporting homeless families, in particular, the Port Gardner neighborhood does support homeless students. We raise money every year at a holiday party for the principals at Jackson Elementary School and Sequoia High School for food for their backpack programs. It's an insult to say that this neighborhood hates homeless children and anyway, I do see elements in 1 and 2 that are valuable, and I don't know if that can ever be changed again at this point. We've kind of gone through them over and over again, but I'd like to see that the green space gets considered, and one other thing is the way that it's written. It seems like black and white. It's either this way and you get one portion of the elements, or this way and you get the others. I don't know if there's any way to amend what we have at this point now, or
I'm going to interrupt
and look
you.
at it. Okay.
I apologize.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your comments. Is there another person from the audience? Please come forward. Thank you.
Yes.
Raven Campbell, 7625 Tye Road. I am here in support of Alternative 2. As Jim mentioned, we have almost no space to move people who are in shelters into. I believe that the changes proposed strike an excellent balance between the needs for open space and the need to provide this essential housing for our most vulnerable. It's important to have as much as possible, and honestly, it really is that often shift between the shelter and your car. And the longer you keep this from being built, the longer that goes on, and the less likely people are to get housed at all. Also, I want to bring up this canard that is always brought up, that always, oh, move it into downtown. Well, if you try to force everything new into one tiny area, only the most profitable uses will prevail. Supportive housing will have to compete with literally any other use you can think of. Barring a miracle, who do you think is going to win? certainly not things that are less profitable, like low-income housing. This is justice. We can present a new, different vision. We don't have to end up like Seattle, where people are pushed out and they're scrambling to get the housing they need. We have an opportunity to get to that need and to not be in a place as desperate as our neighbors to the south. But we can only do that if we tackle that now. While the numbers on the sites may be low, literally anything helps. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other folks who would like to come to the podium?
Hello, my name is Annette Floyd, and I live on 1932 Summit. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge all the work that's been done on this issue and all the people that are here and have true concerns about this, and recognize that the needs it exists, and I'm extremely concerned about the homeless. I'm concerned, I just have to take a moment to just express my concern. I'm concerned that when I leave church on Sunday, there's a man laying on the ground, and I'm driving by him because I'm becoming desensitized to this situation, and I have to compare it to what happens in I think to myself, is this what happened in Germany at a time when I don't even see people anymore? I can't go to the 7-Eleven without fear, and we're trying to improve walkability, but my heart breaks for these people, and I do want to help. But besides that, Everett has to think, it's your job as a planning commissioners to think about these neighborhoods that have kind of a continuancy of design. We can't just plop things here and there and all of that. We have to look at the overall thing of like, how does the outside world come into Everett so it's a livable city? We also have heard climate change is real, giving up this space, instead of taking the Norton playfield, let's build it up bigger, better, make it more usable so that as we develop in other areas, more people are attracted to use that space. I am supportive of another facility, just not here. I think we need our people to have stronger support. Many people need more services than a single family person might want. I'm not making generalizations, but there are needs for employment and how accessible things are to them. So I realize that it's property that is available, but we could look at it in a greater plan. And so I'm against it in this location, but supportive of the overall aim and goals as other people here are. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there any other member of the audience that would like to come to the podium and speak at this time?
I'm just practicing, so please don't judge me. If the housing prices keep going up each year, then soon everybody won't live in a house. And then everybody will be in prison, except for people who make the laws, I think. But I think we should stop this and lower the prices so less people are in jail and more people can play out, or kids can play outside, more college kids, and then more people can learn from schools, and then everything could be normal-ish, kinda.
Could I have you state your name at the, into the microphone? No, no apologies.
My name is Leon.
Hi, Leon. Where do you live?
3211 Grand Avenue.
So you're an Everett resident. We really appreciate you coming up and stating what you think about this issue.
Okay.
Anyone else would like to speak?
Good evening, Victor Harris, 3017 Lombard in beautiful downtown Everett. And I hope you, commissioners, get to make the laws, or at least write the laws. One thing that struck me in Mr. Giffen's reading of the proposals was the extension or the expansion of bus service, transportation service from 500 yards to a quarter of a mile. It seems to me there's something a little off with that, and I think you should recommend that we hold to that 500 feet, or 500 yards. Must be 500 feet, 500 yards is more than a quarter mile, what am I? So that's the one thing. The other thing is I'm a little bit disappointed that this public hearing comes up before the next item on the agenda. Because I think the next item on the agenda is going to eliminate a couple things that are going to demonstrate the importance of our open spaces and why we need them from rainwater distribution and so on and so forth, as we heard in the first presentation. 132, keep pausing here. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other members of the audience? Please come on forward.
Pam Kepford, 5621 Rockefeller Avenue. I love talking to government. Anyway, everybody going on about green space. My neighborhood does not have a park or a green space, so what can I say? Actually, we're going to get one. They're building the Y. I mean, I guess now that they're building the Y there on Colby, we're actually going to get a park, our very first park ever, if you don't count the schoolyard, which apparently the public really can't use the schoolyards. Anyway, so I just want to say that. Green spaces are lovely, but we don't all get them. The R1 dream is fast passing away. And the millennials apparently like to live in downtown high-rises. I have no idea what that's about because I have the R1 dream, but I'm a fading member of society, I'm afraid, just because of my age. I think it's important. I'm supporting number 2 here. It is an example that the city council can set for other local governments. And I'd also like to point out that Everett is going to change a lot in the near future when the light rail comes. The whole area down by the train station is going to be redeveloped. There's an awful lot of services down there for needy people that are going to go away as that area is developed. And I think the city should maintain any option that they can in order to maybe fill in some of those gaps that will be even larger in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there any other members of the audience that would like to step forward and speak? Seeing none, is there any members of the commission that would entertain move to close the hearing?
So moved.
I'll second.
Commissioner Finch?
Yes.
Commissioner McGinn?
Yes.
Commissioner Zelinski?
Yes.
Commissioner Tisdall?
Yes.
Commissioner Holland?
Yes.
Chair Beck?
Yes. All right, so in front of me, I have 2 alternatives for City of Everett Planning Commission Resolution number 1914. The first resolution recommends that the City Council maintain supportive housing as permitted use in the single-family zones on publicly owned property. And I apologize, that is the second alternative that I read first. Let me be clear about that. So that was alternative 2. Alternative 1 is a resolution recommending the city council amend the zoning code by removing supportive housing as permitted use in single-family zones. Comments?
Sure, I have some comments. So, in reading the two alternatives, my concern is the elimination of any process for a multifamily or commercial zone. I am in support of alternative 1. However, I believe that it needs to have some aspects of alternative 2, specifically as it relates to notification, parking analysis, which could allow for a reduction, not just a static parking. Pedestrian connectivity, if we do need that. Also transit access to be in close proximity so people can get to services. Not, as my question earlier this evening was related to just the notification process, and in most cases there wouldn't be. And even if the use were to, supportive housing was allowed in a multifamily zone, it doesn't mean that it's not right next to a single-family zone that may have impacts that a hearing examiner can consider. So compatibility with that neighborhood, I think, is extremely important. So at this particular time, I'm not really in support of either option, other than I'm more supportive of option 1 than I am of option 2. So.
I'm in support of alternative 1 as well. And I echo Commissioner Holland's comments on the need to ensure that any supportive housing development is successful. And so some of that comes down to thoughtful planning around siting and the kinds of services that may be provided there, as well as access those residents may have to the supportive facilities that they might need. I think that the parking component is adequately addressed as relates to a transportation plan, but alternative 1 could, I think, benefit from some additional management planning. I will say this is a land use matter, in my opinion, not an equity issue, not a humanitarian issue. As we've talked before, there are 4 sites that fall under the applicability for alternative 2. 2 of those sites are in the same neighborhood, a single-family neighborhood with an historic overlay. The other 2 sites, one is developed to density, the other one is bifurcated by a road. So we're really talking about 2 sites in a historic overlay. And if we compare that to other public property, we're talking about roughly 20 acres as opposed to 7 acres. So we're not saying, at least I'm not saying, that I'm not in favor of permanent supportive housing. Quite the contrary. I'd like to see those types of developments be sited as efficiently and effectively as possible.
I'm of a mind with the 2 commissioners who have spoken so far on this. I also support alternative 1, primarily because of the small number of sites that would be precluded by going with alternative 1. And because the supportive housing that I'm familiar with generally takes the form of multifamily format. And since 2 of those 4 sites are entirely surrounded by R1 zoning or single-family zoning, there's probably only really 2 viable sites that would be precluded by going with alternative 1. But I also share the concerns about maintaining some of the distinctions of supportive housing from other multifamily. As Chris mentioned, the public review process or the public notification process, I think, should be retained for sites that are adjacent to single-family, either single-family homes or single-family zoned property or lands. And also, I think the proximity to transit is important as kind of a proxy for proximity to services. which transit can take you to. And as I mentioned a month ago, I think we should incorporate into the notion of proximity that it is accessible via a safe pedestrian route from the site to the transit stop. And I also support extending that to the quarter mile rather than the 500 feet, because we don't want to eliminate sites that may be appropriate for supportive housing. I think all of us up here want to see supportive housing continue to develop in Everett, but within the confines of zoned commercial or multifamily lands.
Any other comments?
I would as well. I think I'm more like Chris than my other two colleagues in that I struggle with both, but I can live with one with the changes recommended. I think if we're really talking about affordability, and I got lots of time in this whole helping those folks, so I take a little offense of being looked in the eye and talked that I don't care about people. But aside from that, let's get back to the subject, and that is, if this is really an affordable housing issue, there's affordable housing issues at Boeing, there's affordable housing issues at the school district. So if this is something that we're really going to tackle, and I know we're talking specifically about the supportive housing, but those are the reasons that I think the transparency in 2 is very lackful, or there isn't any, and I don't think that that is really something that I would want to put my name on. And again, if alternative 2 is so much better for the affordable aspect, then let's open that whole up to all affordable housing, not just supportive housing, because the next step, when and if they ever get out of the supportive, there never will be that next step for them.
Any other comments? So I echo what my fellow commissioners, I think it was eloquently stated. My major concern was process. I think that I hear the urgency, I understand the urgency of needing to deploy as much supportive housing as possible at this moment. But I also think that it's very, very important, if what you're trying to build is community, that the public is engaged in that process of figuring out what that means. So for me, this was a transparency issue. And I think that part of when you buy in a single-family residential area is you have some predictability about what the physical structure is within that area. So I think everyone kind of knows my feelings on this particular issue. And if anyone has any other comments, I'll entertain a movement.
Just one additional comment, based on the comments I've heard thus far, and maybe it's a question for staff. I think the intent for both options related to definitions, Alan, was so to amend the multifamily dwelling definition to include permanent supportive housing would support the 2 alternatives, where you look at a permitted use, you look at the definition of a multiple family dwelling, and it includes permanent supportive housing, which would be allowed in all, whatever zones they're allowed in, I guess. So my question to you is the definition, to add that into the type of unit covered under a multifamily dwelling, would it be necessary to keep that in there, or put it in there, or just continue to have just a supported housing? So I'm just looking for what your thought was to add that to that definition, I guess.
the intent in adding permanent supportive housing to the definition of multifamily was so that we would regulate supportive housing just as multifamily housing. I've heard commissioners express a concern about treating it that way tonight, but that is how we treated it before it was added to the code as supportive housing in all zones in 2016. Of the 4 supportive housing projects that have been built or approved since 2016, 3 of them have been in multifamily zones. We really haven't had any negative comments about, even though they went through a public process, we really had no negative comments about the supportive housing in the multifamily zones where they've been proposed or approved since 2016. We think that in terms of the allowing it as a permitted use in multifamily housing, that's the way it always has been. I think in most, prior to 2016, in most communities, if it's regulated at all, the would be considered multifamily housing. I think that that we would staff would recommend keeping or making this change so that supportive housing in a multifamily zone would not have the same kind of public process as it would in a single family zone, and that we would go back really to where we were prior to 2016 in the multifamily zones.
So a follow-up question on that. So the 3 that have been approved since 2016 have been required to do a management plan, and the other 3 different, I think there was 3 different items in the current code. Access to transportation, written management plan, and then there was another option that talked about, compliance inspection or whatever. So they were subject to those 3 under the current supportive housing. Is that correct? Okay, thank you.
In the multifamily? No, the ones that were approved since then. Okay, I think we're going to have to, before I give you a definitive answer on that, I think we're going to have to do a little more research, but.
Well, so the way I read it, it's just in the beginning of the code, and I'll read it to you, and this is how I interpreted it. So under section A, it says permanent supportive housing shall comply with the development standards and design guidelines for multiple family development for the zone in which such housing is located, except as specified herein. And then, so there was 3 different things that are specified in it. So comply with the multifamily, but there's 3 different things. So one would be a density issue related to single family and things like that. And then access to transit, and then a written management plan, and then this oversight stuff. So my assumption is the way it reads is that they need to comply with this except for these 4 different items that are outlined in the supportive housing plan. So that, I guess that was my question. And so those ones that have been approved since this has been adopted would have been subject to more scrutiny than what's being proposed in option 1 today. Option 1 today says not allowed in single families, or any single family zone, and there isn't any additional scrutiny related to access to transit or written management plan or any of those other things. That's kind of how I read the alternatives today. So that was what I was trying to clarify.
Is that amendment to put it in?
And I guess, David and I might be remembering things a little bit differently from his memory and my memory, and so without the project files in front of us here, I can't answer a question about how those were reviewed. It sounds like the concern there is that the commission would be that under this section that a project in the multifamily zone would not be subject to these criteria. Is that the question?
Yeah, so Yeah, under alternative one, it would, and it, you know, it says that you don't, nothing's subject to the current supportive housing requirements under alternative one.
Yeah, that's correct. And our staff's recommendation is that
Right.
these would only apply if you had chosen alternative two, and those would only apply in single-family zones.
And just for one final clarification process, were any of those, and I know you don't have the applications or anything in front of you or the file, would any of those had to go through a hearing examiner process, or were those all administrative, regardless of the public notice process? Were those?
Those would have been planning director review, not hearing examiner review.
Thank you.
Thoughts from the commission? Commissioner Zelinski?
Well, I guess my preference would be to amend alternative one as it's written, to retain the requirement that's currently in the existing code as it exists today for proximity to transit or access to transit, and for public review for sites that are adjacent to single family. So that would be my preference, and if you need a motion to that effect, if we need to get a vote on it, I could do that.
I would also think it would be advisable to still require the management plan aspect for the use. In just looking at what that code is, there was the access and the 500, it was either the 500 or the quarter mile aspect, which I think quarter mile is generally what's required. But I also think there's other aspects in alternative two, Commissioner Zelinski, that you discussed earlier, related to ensuring that there is adequate access to the transit facilities as well. So when I look through the bullets under alternative two, it seems to me like bullet two, bullet three. So bullet two is related that they're allowed in multifamily and commercial zones and regulated as multifamily. So maybe the last portion of bullet two wouldn't necessarily apply, but with the added bullet three, a written management plan as well, to include that, and in addition to that, to recommend not amending the multifamily definition. But to also include the walking aspect of it. So I don't know how that motion actually would go, but anyhow, those are my thoughts.
Okay, I'm okay with that addition, which is that the management plan also be included as a requirement. I debated that in my own mind as to whether I thought that was important. So I'm willing to be persuaded that it's important, so. I would therefore make a motion, Madam Chair, that we recommend alternative one, the resolution approving alternative one, with the changes that we retain the requirements for supportive housing, for a written management plan, the access to public transit, and the public review or early public notification process for sites that are adjacent to single family.
Well done. Do I hear a second?
Go ahead. Just one question, I guess. When you say proxy or adjacent to, do you mean they're actually next to? Because in your earlier comments, you said either adjacent to the zone and or a single family.
Right, single family homes or single family zoning, either or.
Okay.
Right.
Second.
Thank you.
You ready to vote?
We're ready to vote.
May I,
Sure.
may I ask a clarifying question here? And what I'd like to do, I think, is just state what I think I understand the motion to be. The motion would be to not allow supportive housing in single-family zones, but to allow it in multifamily and commercial zones, subject to prior public notification if it abuts or is adjacent to single-family zoning or single-family dwellings in other zones, then that you want to retain the requirements under 1939-155 that would require proximity to transit with a quarter-mile walking distance with an improved safe pedestrian surface. And let's see, did I get all of those then?
The management plan?
And the management plan, which would be part of, yeah,
Part of their
1939-155, yeah.
Right.
Okay,
Yes.
so, yeah, that, anything else that I missed?
You mentioned the early public review, right?
Right.
Yes. That's it. That's my understanding of what I proposed.
I think, just for clarification too, for you, Alan, I think it wasn't specifically stated in the motion, but I think it was, what it was discussed was not only the access to transit, but the requirement for sidewalk improvements as necessary to make sure that there's adequate access to transit.
Right.
Yeah, safe pedestrian access.
Safe pedestrian
Quarter-mile
route.
walking distance
Yes.
for transit. Right.
And just to clarify, I think you addressed this, but are you proposing that the public review process include not just adjacency to single-family zones, but also to single-family homes in multifamily zones and commercial zones?
Yes.
Okay, now, as for process, that's public notification prior to application that Commissioner Finch was just asked.
That's what I was asking about. I mean, I guess my personal opinion on this is if we have single-family homes in multifamily zones, I don't know that we need to be treating those in the same way that we are treating notice to single-family zones. They're not highest and best use, they're not consistent with zoning, and so I wouldn't want to make it more difficult to have a supportive housing project in an appropriate zone. And so I guess I would want to remove that component, limit it to adjacency to single-family zone, not homes in multifamily zones.
I'd like to follow that up. I kind of agree with what Commissioner Finch is saying. I think that by adding some of the other aspects of the alternative, we're making it more difficult for supportive housing in a zone that we've determined this is an appropriate zone for this type of structure. So I caution us in terms of putting more parameters on what I kind of have issue with the term supportive housing because I think supportive housing as a definition was created because we put a conditional use in a residential zone. If you think about it, I think Commissioner Yanisky, I hope I pronounced his name right, Yanisak, was making this point the last meeting, is what's the difference? And I think once you remove supportive housing from single-family zones, what I would ask, and we can't deal with that tonight, is there a way to expedite the review process and make it faster, less expensive for supportive housing? That's how I would, if you're going to tweeze out a definition, that's why I would tweeze out a definition, is how can we make this move faster in those areas where it is appropriate?
Well, I believe there's a motion and a second on the floor.
I agree, there is.
I'm also supportive of both what Commissioner Finch stated related to notice requirements, but I do still think it's extremely important when you're adjacent to those single-family uses, when there's an opportunity to at least comment on the application and have an opportunity to review it, to allow the applicant to potentially amend what it is they're proposing to help be compatible with the community, so, with the adjacent single-family zone.
Madam Chairman, Chairperson.
Okay, sorry.
Point of clarification, and I haven't heard this in the motion, and the way I would interpret your motion thus far without asking this question is that this would be reviewed by staff in a multifamily zone or commercial zone and not by the hearing examiner.
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you.
So we do have a motion for a vote at this time. I think we should go ahead and take the vote.
Commissioner Finch,
Yes.
Commissioner McGinn,
Yes.
Commissioner Zelinski,
Yes?
Commissioner Tisdall,
Yes.
Commissioner Holland,
Yes.
Chair Beck.
Yes. Okay. Moving along, we have, and I need clarification, we have about 6 or 7 minutes before, after 9 PM, do we need to formally extend the meeting?
Not based on my presentation.
Okay, well, let's have at it.
Roll it.
Terrific. Moving along to item number 3.
Yeah, so we just wanted to kind of do a heads up about ReThink Zoning, and we released the determination of significance, which starts a scoping process for preparing an environmental impact statement. We're going to start gathering public input starting on October 14th through the November 12th. You have that in your packet. We're looking at 3 alternatives. One is basically kind of a no action, existing plans and regulations, and then we're looking at 2 alternatives. One alternative is just the things that we've already been talking to you largely about, is the code consolidation, simplify the code, looking at a few new housing types perhaps within zones. And then the third alternative is a transit-focused growth alternative that we're trying to align with the regional growth strategy for this area, and that's going to start looking at some of the accommodating of population and employment, particularly around the transit nodes and light rail nodes within the community, and start looking at some potential changes in land use which would be implemented not in this first phase of things, but actually in the next 3 years as the next growth management update. So anyhow, we're just kind of kicking this off. We're going to have 2 open houses next week, one on Monday, the 21st at the Performing Arts Center, Anderson Room. It's a lunchtime open house from 12 to 1:30, and then the following Thursday on the 24th out at Cascade High School in the library at 6:30. And so just a way of starting to introduce some of this things to folks, and we're going to continue to progressively get a little bit more focused and dialed in on some of the details of this and get more input as we go along. So.
Thank you. I do have one quick request. If it's at all possible, if we could get a 3-month calendar. We're starting to push up again to the holidays and things like that, so we can know what's coming up on the agenda. That would be helpful. Any other comments from Planning Commissioner? Well, with that, we are adjourned.